the human being. On the quest to understand ourselves scientifically, we know so much from the form to the organs, cells, molecules, atoms, waves, and more. Yet every new discovery teaches us one immutable and persistent lesson. We know very little of ourselves, our reality, our potential. Especially the mysterious psychedelic compound DMT. DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is a molecule produced within the human brain that is also known to be the most potent psychedelic substance in the world. Groundbreaking research has recently taken place. But before we take that dive, let's explore where it all started. German pharmacologist Otto Louis was the first to discover neuronal communication based on chemical release. He also discovered the first neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. Since then, the classical neurotransmitters were established, such as serotonin, which regulates mood and perception, and dopamine, which plays a role in how we feel pleasure and is a big part of how we think and plan. In 1931, a Canadian chemist named Richard Mansky synthesized an unsuspecting chemical that had been used for visionary and spiritual purposes for thousands of years. In June of 1965, German researchers Franzen and Gross discovered and quantified DMT in human blood and urine. In 1972, Saavedra and Axelrod demonstrated biosynthesis of DMT in mammalian tissues. Throughout the 1960s, scientists attempted to find a link between endogenous DMT and psychotic disorders. However, the results of these studies proved inconclusive. And then, due to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, all research in all countries on all psychedelic compounds stopped. Decades went by, and these compounds, including the ones produced within, went unstudied. Only thanks to brave psychonauts like Dennis and Terence McKenna was the story of DMT kept alive.
Psychedelics, these were marginalized, these were ignored. DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT, they're not just about the visual experience. There's a huge emotional experience to it, and they induce ecstasy.
At the turn of the 1990s, Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico broke through that strict prohibition with the first human DMT studies as he injected nearly 400 doses into roughly 6 volunteers.
The design of the study was fairly straightforward: give people DMT and measure as many variables as possible. In the case of this study, which was going to be the first new psychedelic research in the U.S. really for over 20 years, I had to sort of anticipate a lot of objections that would come my way from the regulatory agencies that oversee this kind of research.
In the year 2000, Dr. Strassman published his findings in the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. This book brought the topic of DMT to a mainstream audience outside of strict scientific circles. Dr. Strassman named DMT the Spirit Molecule based on the consistent reports of realer-than-real spiritual experiences from high-dose administration.
I started off seeing shapes, and then there were cats, and then I felt like I fell out of space and ended up at the Last Supper in heaven or something. I don't consider myself spiritual, and I'm going, why would my brain take me there? I was going through some emotional turmoil, and I didn't feel safe or welcome or like I had friends, and it just felt at the end like it was okay and I was loved.
A decade later, in 2010, the book became a documentary hosted by comedian and podcaster Joe Rogan, catapulting the discussion of DMT and ayahuasca onto an even bigger global stage, reaching tens of millions of viewers.
What is ayahuasca?
It's just like it's like a tree root. It's got DMT in it.
So for someone like me, the ayahuasca experience is essential. I need to be beaten down occasionally.
Did a really eye-opening experience of ayahuasca. It was really intense.
In his book, Dr. Strassman hypothesized that the pineal gland, a gland long associated with mysticism in Eastern traditions, is the source of DMT in the brain. But in 2013, Dr. Jimo Borjigan led a study at the University of Michigan, which finally proved that the pineal gland produces DMT and put all the speculation to rest. This study further increased the interest of DMT in pop culture.
You don't even need to seek DMT externally to you. No, your pineal gland produces it.
My guests are terrified! Yes! And their brains are releasing adrenaline, dopamine, even dimethyltryptamine from the pineal gland!
But there was still speculation that we might only produce this mysterious compound at select moments of life, some of which only occur in a fraction of the population.
They've proven that their pineal gland is producing dimethyltryptamine, which is what it's always been anecdotal evidence. So now they know that it's not just produced by the liver and the lungs, but it's also produced by this little gland. And this little gland, they think, during near-death experiences and during heavy REM sleep, it's producing DMT.
DMT is ubiquitous in the natural world. It's found in hundreds, if not thousands, of plants. Ones that are used for their psychoactivity and ones that aren't. Been found in every mammal that's been studied. I don't think DMT would have gotten anywhere near as popular during the first wave of clinical research if it weren't for the fact that it was endogenous.
As the public continued to show their interest in DMT with increasing internet searches, DMT began to hit the mainstream music scene.
And dimethyltryptamine and lysergic acid without dynamite. The vibes are effervescent, delicious, just how they should be.
I done died and lived again on DMT, huh? See, this the type of high that won't come down. This the type of high that...
Comedians began spreading the word about the experience.
DMT is like, hey, you know all of this reality and perception that you are super familiar with and very convinced is real? Well, sorry about this. Zip.
Everyone all of a sudden wanted to know, what in the world is DMT? And why do we produce this otherworldly compound in our brains?
Give people DMT and they all came back with the same story. I was blasted out of my consciousness.
What exactly does an LSD or DMT breakthrough feel like?
Even the lesser understood compound 5-MeO-DMT began hitting popular internet shows, touting its mystical experience of oneness with creation.
My experience with 5-MeO is a connection to all that is. I felt the direct connection to spirit, to soul, to my own soul.
Lesser known still is the fact that this compound too is found within humans. Just as the popularity of the DMT discussion seemed to be reaching its peak, it happened. Former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson decided to take the 5-MeO-DMT plunge.
Boom.
My whole life totally changed. It sounds like a movie script, but it's really the real deal.
Following his 5-MeO-DMT experience, Tyson would discuss his transformation from an ego-driven ex-fighter into a spiritually transformed individual.
How did this happen to me? I'm not leading my ship. I'm not driving this fucking car, not me.
After Tyson made his 5-MeO-DMT use public in 2019, the interest in DMT reached an all-time high. That same year, a groundbreaking discovery out of the University of Michigan regarding endogenous DMT was published. It should have garnered global media headlines across the world based on the fact that it radically altered everything we knew about endogenous DMT.
The paper that came out of Ann Arbor in 2019 is a landmark publication.
I think it's a game changer in terms of beginning to expand our understanding of the role of endogenous DMT. What's surprising to me is, why has this been overlooked for so long?
The lead author for the paper is a young scientist straight out of Youngstown, Ohio, Dr. John Dean.
When I started my undergrad, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to get into. I'd always enjoyed science and started to just take the prereq classes that I would need to get a bachelor's degree. Around that time, I had a very good friend of mine die, sort of unexpectedly, and that kind of sent me into a little existential era. I was prescribed just like a anti-anxiety medication. So that really was kind of profound to see the impact that taking this little pill could have on my psychology.
John reported that his prescription didn't help him process his emotions, leading to a hiatus from school so he could tour with his indie band, Asleep, who ended up performing on South by Southwest and recording with famed producer Steve Albini. He spent time teaching guitar to autistic children at Youngstown State until he rediscovered his love for science.
Then I took a chemistry course and was super into it. And it was around that time when I read Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. That kind of got me interested in the idea of like mind over matter, matter over mind, and that sort of thing. Coming to realize that there's this compound that's floating around in humans that's relatively understudied, that is one of the most powerful psychedelics there is. The fact that something like that's floating around in our bodies, even if it's doing nothing, very intriguing. What does that mean for reality? What does that mean for how the brain works? We don't know, right?
DMT was always believed to be produced in such trace amounts that its presence was inconsequential to human consciousness. However, the 2019 publication spearheaded by John Dean and Jimo Borjigan turned this whole scientific belief on its head. There are 3 groundbreaking discoveries to this 2019 paper that John published. The first was in regards to just how much DMT is actually produced in the mammalian brain.
We actually put a probe directly into the brain of a living rat. We would directly sample the brain fluid, the dialysate, if you will, from these animals. And then we would run these on an analytical chemistry technique called high-performance liquid chromatography. And then we compared DMT and serotonin. And in that regard, what we found was, in my opinion, the heart of the study, that DMT was actually in nanomolar concentrations in the range of serotonin.
The significance of DMT being found at levels comparable to serotonin is found in just how vital serotonin is for everyday life. From sleeping, eating, and digestion to bone health and wound health, it's a natural mood stabilizer. Low levels of serotonin are associated with depression, anxiety, and insomnia, while people with normal levels report feeling happier, calmer, and more focused. DMT is also found in comparable levels to dopamine, which is released when the brain expects a reward, and in normal amounts helps with alertness, motivation, focus, happiness, and feelings of euphoria. So why is DMT swimming around in mammalian brains at levels comparable to serotonin and dopamine?
I'm really more concerned with what is DMT doing in the normal waking brain. Is it responsible for visual perception? We know that it has antidepressant properties. This has been shown in microdosing too. Those studies are intriguing because it sets up the idea that you don't necessarily need this psychedelic amount of this compound in your brain for some sort of natural effect.
This points to or indicates the possibility of the existence of a DMT neurotransmitter system. What would the role be? What is, the hallmark of the DMT experience? People, come out of it and they say that was more real than real. So there is a profound, sense of certainty and truth, which is associated with elevated brain levels of DMT. If you wanted to speculate wildly, one could argue, that the DMT neurotransmitter system mediates our sense of reality.
If it is correct that DMT mediates our sense of reality, then is reality itself a partial hallucination? Or could DMT be even more functional to our everyday waking consciousness than just psychedelic experiences?
Well, maybe we're in a simulation right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, seriously. And I mean, like the strongest argument for us being in a simulation, probably being in a simulation, I think is the following. That 40 years ago, we had Pong, like 2 rectangles and a dot. That was what games were. Now, 40 years later, we have photorealistic 3D simulations with millions of people playing simultaneously, and it's getting better every year. And soon we'll have virtual reality, augmented reality. If you assume any rate of improvement at all, then the games will become indistinguishable from reality. We should hope that that's true, because otherwise, if civilization stops advancing, then that may be due to some calamitous event that erases civilization.
Simulation theory is nothing new. As it is presently more of a hypothesis, some scientists have linked their understanding of it directly with DMT as being the key to unlock the matrix. Measuring DMT or even serotonin and dopamine directly is difficult. Therefore, basic neurochemistry relies heavily on measuring the capacity for biosynthesis of these chemicals via the enzymes that produce them. Enzymes are built from folded proteins that allow the body to convert raw materials from the environment into chemicals that the body uses to function. In order for the team at the University of Michigan to understand DMT synthesis, they first began looking at the enzymes INMT and AADC that bring the amino acid tryptophan all the way to DMT. And this is what sparked the second groundbreaking discovery in the 2019 paper. Just where inside the brain are the DMT enzymes found?
The 2 enzymes which are responsible for DMT synthesis occur in the same nerve cell, which is the final or the next to the final step in, definitively saying DMT is synthesized in the mammalian brain.
We were the first group, to my knowledge, to really emphasize or look for the 2 enzymes being present in the same cells at the same time. So we reasoned, though, that you need both of those enzymes to take tryptophan to DMT. If the same cells are expressing those enzymes, that the likelihood of DMT synthesis is much stronger in those areas. What we found was that the brain was one of the hotter sites of co-localization of the 2 DMT genes.
Dr. Dean found expression levels of both enzymes in the pineal gland, choroid plexus, and throughout the cerebral cortex.
We found very high expression of the DMT biosynthetic genes in that area where the cerebrospinal fluid is made.
Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is a colorless liquid produced inside the ventricles of the choroid plexus in order to supply nervous system tissue with nutrients, protect the brain from trauma, and carry away metabolic waste. We talked to one of the world's leading cerebrospinal fluid researchers, Dr. Mauro Zapatera, a medical doctor who also received his PhD from Harvard University, focusing on the significance of CSF in brain development.
I was looking at this section of a human brain at 8 weeks in development. And inside that space was this cauliflower-like structure. And it was huge. It was ginormous compared to the size of the developing cortex. And I turned to my colleague and I said, "What is that structure?" And he said, "That's the choroid plexus." I said, "Wait, if that produces CSF and it's so large, the CSF must have an important role in development." There was a teacher who was teaching us craniosacral therapy. We hold various areas of the body, mostly the cranium and the sacrum, and we assess for subtle pulsations that are occurring in the tissues, in the energy field, but also in the cerebrospinal fluid. And then he made a comment that, the cerebrospinal fluid is 1 molecule away from seawater. And I entered this, I'm sort of a skeptic with many things, and so I entered this with skepticism. And so I started that evening, I remember going home and looking up what the cerebrospinal fluid was. And I realized that there was not much current research going on in this fluid. It's dispersed throughout the ventricles. It even bathes the outside of the brain, and it goes down the middle of our spinal canal in the central canal, and it bathes our entire spinal cord. Essentially, if something gets dropped into this fluid, it can be dispersed through the entire brain. And so I wanted to see, has DMT ever been shown to be in the cerebrospinal fluid? And it actually has.
Another hypothesis is that breathing exercises can induce an increase in DMT in the brain, causing the visionary experiences that many have claimed are very similar to psychedelics.
Could breath work affect the cerebrospinal fluid pulsations that affect the way that cerebrospinal fluid is generated? You know, it's a signal to the choroid plexus to produce more of a certain compound, possibly DMT.
While visionary experiences induced by breathing exercises have been reported for thousands of years,